Welcome to session 122 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 2nd of May. Today we'll be looking at Isaiah 52 to 54 and Psalm 119 verses 97 to 128. But so far in Isaiah, we've read through the first half of Isaiah, focused on the judgment and future hope of Jerusalem and the nations, and then the judgment on Israel's leaders for who they put their trust in. Through these different preachers and visions, we gathered a series of images. God was about to pour judgment on the Israelites for their wickedness and corruption. This punishment was described like God laying an axe to a tree and just a stump remaining. It was destruction intended to purge and purify. Out of the remnant of his people, this tree stump, God would raise up a branch from the line of David, who would be a king who reigned over the earth and brought peace. Focusing on the foreign nations, we got mention of a day of the Lord. On this day, God will bring judgment, waging war on evil and wickedness. He will destroy powers that set themselves up against him, whether they be human kings or spiritual beings. These foreign nations are judged for their pride, oppression, and wickedness. Isaiah specifically mentions Babylon, Assyria, Philistia, Moab, Cush, also known as Ethiopia, Egypt, and Tyre. Focusing on Israel's leaders, Isaiah pointed out that the judicial leaders, the priests, and even some of those who claimed to be prophets were actually proud drunkards who put their trust in their own power and authority rather than in God. But through these preachers, Isaiah highlights some key ideas. The Israelites are not to turn to these foreign nations for support and protection. God is in control and will use all of this for his purposes. Eventually, even these foreign nations will be brought into God's future kingdom. In that time, all people will celebrate, feast, and worship God, led by a king who will bring peace and flourishing. Then we started the second half of Isaiah, written to the people after the exile, giving them a new hope. It was God that led the other nations to do what they did, not those nations' own strength or their gods. God was always in control and will lead his people to flourish again. As God led the foreign nations against each other, ultimately he will still see all nations brought under his authority, worshipping him. We got the introduction of someone God calls my servant, saying, I have put my spirit upon him, he will bring forth justice to the nations. That's Isaiah 42. Verses 1. This servant will be despised by Israel, but is to be a covenant to God's people, loyal to God. This servant is contrasted with Israel, who is described as a blind servant because they continue to reject God. We've got imagery of God divorcing Israel, but will one day restore them to himself. Let's jump in with today's reading, Isaiah 52 to 54. Today continues the message that God's wrath over his people is over. God's salvation is now here. Zion will once again be strong. It will once again be clean and pure. No longer will they be oppressed by the likes of Egypt or Assyria. We then get a poem speaking of how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. That's Isaiah 52 verse 7. This may seem odd, but Isaiah is creating the image of one rushing back to Jerusalem to tell them that their God has not forgotten them, but is coming back to the city himself as their new king. The words good news are the same words that the New Testament use for the gospel. Both here in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and in the culture surrounding them, this term for good news was used to declare the new reign of a king. So with this good news, the messenger tells the people of the city to make themselves pure and trust that God is once again going to protect and lead them. And God then turns back to his servant for the third time. He declares that he will exalt his servant. There was a period when many were disgusted by him, but there will be a time when all kings and nations will be astonished and listen to him. But before that, this servant has to suffer. He came from humble roots and was not much to look at. He was despised and rejected by men. In his suffering, he carried our sorrows and our sins. In doing so, he brought us peace and healing. He allowed himself to suffer, to die for the sins of others, and to be buried an innocent man. But this all happened because it was God's will. Because of God's righteous servant, many will be considered righteous. We've mentioned it before, that there are some people that want to claim this servant is God's people, Israel. They've been through a time of suffering, and God is now exalting them back to their original place. The problem with this is whenever God speaks to his people, Israel, he doesn't speak too highly of them. He focuses on their disobedience and their faithlessness, on their sin. Yet when he talks about his servant is obedient, faithful, and righteous. It makes it a little more confusing because a lot of this section of Isaiah is written in the past tense. so it's tempting to look backwards to find out who he could be referring to. But prophets have a weird sense of tense. They spend their time in visions of the future, so from those future perspective, it looks like the past. It seems to me that this servant is a future figure who will be oppressed and hated, but will be obedient all the way to death because there is something in his suffering that will bring righteousness to others. And then we're back to Zion. God calls out to his city like a woman who has been grieving because she could not bear children. Remember, to not be able to have children was considered a curse, the opposite of a blessing. God calls to Zion, this barren woman, and encourages her. He will pour out blessing on her so that she may have children. The blessing will be so great that she will have to make a larger tent to fit all of her children in. God calls his city back to him to once again be his wife. We read a little while ago that God divorced his wife because she had been unfaithful in Isaiah 50 verse 1. But now we see the marriage restored. God is calling his bride back into an intimate relationship with him, all the while declaring how much he loves her. It's going to be great. God will restore the city with great walls and gates filled with precious gemstones. He will teach the new children, and they will be righteous, a holy people, and he will protect his people. No one will oppress them again. No one will attack them or destroy them. Everything will be good. That's Isaiah 52 to 54. Now let's jump in with Psalm 119, verses 97 to 128. We're continuing on with Psalm 119. This psalm isn't attributed to anyone in particular and falls to the category of wisdom psalm. Each stanza has 8 verses each, and each verse within a stanza starts with the same letter of the Hebrew alphabet. With 22 stanzas, we have a different stanza for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In many ways, this psalm can be seen as the ABCs of biblical wisdom. Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We're verses 97 to 104, Maim. Oh, how I love your law, it is my meditation all the day. Verses 105 to 112, Nun. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Verses 113 to 120, Samek. I hate the double-minded, but I love your law. And then verses 121 to 128, Ayin. I have done what is just and right. Do not leave me to my oppressors. Stanza 13, verses 97 to 104, again focuses on how much the psalmist loves the Lord's law and commandments. Because the psalmists have spent all their time meditating on the Lord's teachings, they now have more understanding than their teachers or others much older than they are. The psalmist is kept from evil to better follow God's ways. They can do this because of the understanding they now have to see evil and avoid it. In stanza 14, verses 105 to 112, the psalmist talks about how the word of the Lord is like a lamp to their feet. Whether they are struggling with health or avoiding traps laid by their enemies, the psalmist knows where to place their feet because of God's commands. The psalmist does their best to live by this guidance, and it's their joy to do so. The psalmist spends stanza 15, 113 to 120, reflecting on those who don't hold to the Lord's commands. There are those who are double-minded, who claim to follow the Lord but don't know him or his ways well enough to do so. Meanwhile, the psalmist hides in the Lord's teaching for safety. They see evildoers as a blocker to keeping God's commands and so wants nothing to do with them. While the Lord holds the psalmist up for his faithfulness, he spurns the wicked and those who turn from his teachings. Then, in stanza 16, verses 121 to 128, the psalmist talks more about the struggles and oppressors. The psalmist has held to God's teachings, so now they ask that the Lord keep them from their oppressors and from the wicked. They have waited patiently for God's salvation, but now their eyes are failing them. Therefore, let the Lord rescue his servant with love, giving them understanding and punishing those who have breached God's commands. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.